Welcome back to Southeast Asia Radio. Today, we'll kick off our third season covering Malaysia's orangutan diplomacy and responses from Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia about the ongoing conflict in Gaza.
We'll also discuss some major investments in Southeast Asia and a series of cyber attacks in Indonesia. I'm Lauren Mai.
And I'm Japhet Kitson. Today is July 11th, 2024. On this week's conversation,
the China Coast Guard had kept on increasing the number of vessels that they deployed. They all called in the maritime militia as well. We've reached a point where I think the PLA Navy has also begun to make its presence felt during these resupply, interdiction, shall we say, or intervention in these resupply missions. So I think because of that, there was a need on the part of the Philippines to try something else. That's when they decided to do this.
Greg and Elina had Jay Batongbacal on to discuss the latest intentions over the South China Sea. Before that, let's start with our headlines.
Let's start today by talking about the latest animal being turned into a diplomatic pawn.
Oh no, Panda Diplomacy 2.0? What animal is it this time?
Well, Malaysia is planning to send orangutans as cultural ambassadors to their major economic partners.
Huh. Okay, tell me more.
Malaysia's planned orangutan diplomacy scheme comes after the European Union, one of Malaysia's biggest palm oil importers, who imposed a ban on agricultural products grown in deforested land after 2020.
Right, I remember you talking about that ban in your blog post. The EU's regulation risks economic strain among Malaysia's small farmers, with critics blasting the ban as regulatory imperialism. So I'm curious, how has the public responded to the orangutans?
Unfortunately, Malaysia's plan backfired, with ecological experts calling the scheme obscene and repugnant, given that orangutans are a critically endangered species.
Oh, yeah, fair enough. I guess the panda ambassadors aren't getting any serious competition anytime soon.
We'll have to see if Malaysia's planned orangutan scheme will seriously develop.
Our next story looks at the region's reactions to the ongoing conflict in Gaza. As tensions between Israel and Palestine have heightened in recent months, Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia have voiced their stances on the conflict.
Most recently, Singapore's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Vivian Balakrishnan, announced that Singapore is prepared in principle to recognize Palestine as a sovereign state.
The statement, however, was not made without specific conditions. Balakrishnan noted that Singapore's recognition of Palestine would only occur if the state establishes an effective government and formally accepts Israel's right to exist.
The statement follows Singapore's decision to vote in favor of a resolution from the United Nations expressing support for Palestine's membership into the organization.
The decision was justified under grounds of aligning with Singapore's support for the principles of international law and expressing optimism for the conflict's swift resolution through a two-state solution, which establishes Israel and Palestine as separate nation-states.
Following the minister's statement, Singapore reaffirmed its commitment to fund a $7.4 million package to help Palestine prepare for eventual statehood, and has taken a leading role in training Palestinian officials on topics ranging from urban planning to public finance.
Singapore's focus on conflict resolution and an immediate humanitarian ceasefire echoes world leaders' responses to the ongoing turmoil, particularly as violence has greatly accelerated.
Meanwhile, two other Southeast Asian leaders released statements on the conflict. There was a very interesting phone call between Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim and Indonesian President-elect Prabowo Subianto.
Ooh, what did they talk about?
Prime Minister Anwar announced that Indonesia and Malaysia were both prepared to send peacekeeping forces to Gaza if mandated by the United Nations, even expressing interest in extending peacekeeping efforts to involve other members of ASEAN.
Anwar's statements don't come as a surprise. Adjunct fellow Sophie Lemire's latest commentary dove into the controversy surrounding Malaysia's high-profile interactions with Hamas, a militant Palestinian group the United States considers a terrorist organization.
While Anwar has clarified that Malaysia sought to maintain relations with Hamas without being involved in military activities, the meetings have raised some eyebrows in Washington, even souring diplomatic relations between Malaysia and the U.S.
As the conflict in Gaza continues to develop, we'll have to stay tuned for future announcements from other leaders within the region. Next, we'll look at recent foreign investments in Southeast Asia.
Let's put these details into context. China has expanded its economic footprint in the region with significant investments in Malaysia and Vietnam's IT and infrastructure sectors.
In line with their non-alignment policy, Malaysia accepts investment from both China and the United States. Investors are drawn to its cheap land, low building costs, favorable tax policies, and proximity to Singapore.
Most recently, TikTok's parent company, ByteDance, set up its branch in Malaysia with a $317 million budget to expand its data center.
It's happening in Vietnam as well. In the China-Vietnam high-level meeting on June 26th, Vietnam's Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh expressed the country's interest in partnering with China on a cross-country high-speed railway project.
The investment is part of a region-wide, China-backed railway project that connects China with Southeast Asian countries, including Vietnam, Malaysia, Laos, and Thailand.
In addition to China, another outside power has begun regional investments. Japan established the Asian Zero Emission Community, an initiative shortly after a Chinese state-owned operator acquired grids from Laos and began full-scale power transmission in January.
Japan also announced it would participate in the ASEAN Power Grid, a regional power grid project, as well as finance an inter-island power transmission project in Indonesia.
Japan's investments are part of its larger effort to become an important player in Southeast Asia's energy sector to counter China's influence in the region.
As companies begin to consider Southeast Asia as a favorable destination to diversify their supply chains, businesses within the region have also taken steps to shift away from China.
Right. Singapore's property manager Capital Land Investment wants to invest up to $110 billion on industrial factories in Vietnam as it expects manufacturers to divert supply chains out of China.
Other countries in Southeast Asia are beneficiaries of this shift as well. The company aims to deploy around $200 million in Malaysia and $250 million in Thailand over the next 2 years.
Looks like a lot of competition is going on here.
To cap off our headlines today, we're diving into the worst cyber attack Indonesia has seen in years.
More than 40 government agencies were hit by the attack, disrupting immigration services and major airport operations.
It only gets worse. In addition to government agencies, over 230 public agencies were victimized by the attack. The attackers targeted one of Indonesia's major data centers in Surabaya using a malicious software called Lockbit 3.0.
Isn't that ransomware developed by a Russian group?
Absolutely! It's the same group responsible for a massive data breach in May 2023, affecting over 15 million customers in Indonesia.
Oh, yikes. That's huge.
Yep. This time, the attackers demanded a hefty ransom of $8 million for the decryption key.
So how did President Joko Widodo respond?
He refused to pay the ransom, instead ordering a thorough investigation to determine the cause of the attack and calling for an audit of all government centers.
It was later revealed by the chair of Indonesia's cybersecurity agency that 98% of government data housed in the compromised centers were not backed up due to budget constraints.
It's uncovered a glaring blind spot in Indonesia's cybersecurity. The public outcry from the data breach has even prompted a government official to resign.
A senior leader from the Communication Ministry, Samuel Panggarapan, recently stepped down from office, claiming he was morally responsible for the incident.
Despite his departure, calls for the resignation of other ministers have continued. A digital advocacy group started a petition demanding the resignation of the Communications and Information Minister, Budi Ari Setiadi.
The petition attracted great public attention, with more than 18,500 signatories. In response to the criticism, Budi apologized for the incident and promised to make data backup services mandatory.
So far, the recovery has been slow but steady. As of now, data from 5 out of 200 affected public agencies have been restored, with plans to recover all of the data by August.
Whew, that'll take a while, huh? And those were our headlines. Did we miss anything? Be sure to write us about the topics you're interested in at searadio@csis.org, and we'll be more than happy to cover them.
Up next, Greg and Elina's conversation with Jay Batongbacal. Stay tuned.
Welcome back, folks. I'm Greg Poling with CSIS, joined as ever by Elina Noor with the Carnegie Endowment. Good morning, Elina.
Good morning, Greg.
And the reason it's an early morning for Elina on the West Coast is because we're being joined by Jay Batongbacal with the University of the Philippines, very late in Manila. Jay, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Greg. Good evening, and thanks for having me.
In case anybody fell asleep like a month ago and hasn't been following any of the news, we've got Jay on to talk about yet more escalating tensions in the South China Sea, particularly the pretty brutal incident we saw of China's use of force at Second Thomas or Ayungin Shoal a couple weeks ago on, was it June 17th, right, Jay?
Yes, 17th, Monday morning.
So let me give the quick Reader's Digest summary, and then you just jump in and tell me what really matters here and what I might get wrong. So as of June 17th, the Philippines had kind of held off on a large maritime resupply of the BRP Sierra Madre for over a month, I think, at that point. We'd had the one airdrop resupply of food and material that made some news about a month earlier. There may have been some other quiet resupplies, but then they finally greenlit the first maritime resupply after that break in mid-June. And this time, instead of the Coast Guard being in the lead, the Philippine Navy took lead. As I understand it, they brought out a larger civilian supply ship, which was interesting. We can talk about. It clearly had been kind of steel-plated to avoid Chinese water cannoning, which had been such a problem for earlier resupply missions. But then instead of actually using that ship, they offloaded into 4 rigid-hulled inflatable boats of the Philippine Navy, or RIBs, which all sped toward the shoal from different directions. 2 of them, I think, had engine failure. 2 got through, made it to the BRP Sierra Madre. But what I don't know if the Philippine Navy simply didn't account for was that the Chinese just followed them into the shoal in their own RIBs, massively outnumbered the Philippine naval component. And then we saw, I think, quite arresting videos and photos of Chinese Coast Guard personnel waving knives and boat hooks and axes, ramming the Philippine ship. At one point, one of the collisions caused, I suppose he must have been pinned between the boats or something, but a Philippine serviceman
possibly
had to have his thumb amputated. And then the Chinese punctured the boats intentionally, towed them outside of the shoal and left them adrift. And then a 5-hour, I think, negotiation proceeded before the Philippine Coast Guard was permitted to come in and rescue them. All of which, at least from the perspective here in Washington, seems to have thrown kind of Philippine internal government discussions about what to do at Second Thomas Shoal into complete disarray after what had seemed like 2 years of remarkably consistent and unified policymaking. So what did I miss?
I think that within the government, there has been also a sense of frustration and a need to change the situation in terms of the resupply, because we had been seeing consistent incremental escalation on the part of Chinese to prevent the resupply using the same boats, no? The 2 civilian wooden boats, the Oneida Maze, and escorted by the Philippine Coast Guard vessels. And the
Although
China
also
Coast
escorted
Guard-
by the China Coast Guard.
Yeah, sure. all of them. And the China Coast Guard had kept on increasing the number of vessels that they deployed. They all called in the maritime militia as well. We've reached a point where I think the PLA Navy has also begun to make its presence felt during these resupply, these interdiction, shall we say, or intervention in these resupply missions. So I think because of that, there was a need on the part of the Philippines to try something else. That's when they decided to do this.
So, Jay, there seems to be like this really bizarre disjuncture because the Philippines and China has this bilateral consultation mechanism. We're recording this just a day after they supposedly completed the 9th meeting of this mechanism. And so this has been in place since 2017, right? If I'm not wrong.
Yes.
But at the same time, it seems like things are just worsening, particularly in and around Second Thomas Shoal. So how do you explain this? What's going on?
Well, the BCM has never really been effective from all accounts. It started under the Duterte administration. And from what I gather and from the statements that were issued, especially during the first 6 BCMs, nothing really moved. There are indications that the only thing that ever happened in these BCMs is that the 2 parties would state their positions. The Philippines would give its complaints, especially about the clam digging and this environmental destruction. And Beijing would simply say that we'll talk about it next time. We'll consult with the capital and then come back. But then at the next meeting, nothing would really happen. So it ended up being just a constant stream of meetings where everybody was just talking past each other and looking at the ceiling, counting, I don't know, the tiles maybe or the lights. So that was how the BCM basically played into all of this. It didn't really play a role despite all the complaints. I actually even saw one letter which the government filed with the Supreme Court at one time when there was a case that tried to raise this issue. And in the government's response, they included a letter from one of the secretaries pointing out that with respect to the environmental destruction through clam digging, China never really responded despite all the requests and despite it being on the agenda several times. And that secretary actually was recommending to the foreign secretary, who at the time was Secretary Locsin, to already consider legal options because nothing happens in the BCM. So there's that level of frustration with that mechanism. So under the current administration, well, now they've had 2. The first one, I think, was just cordial, didn't really produce anything new. No, but this latest one, which just finished today, actually, well, it became the opportunity to discuss this very serious incident. No, and from what I understand, this time both parties realized the need to tone down a bit and start de-escalating because trajectory really isn't good. And we've seen, as you know, that we've seen the brutality in which China and the China Coast Guard are now acting in that area. And if it weren't for the self-restraint on the part of the Philippine forces there, I think it could have been a lot worse.
Jay, what do you think de-escalating actually means in this context? Because for over a year now, it seemed that China's kind of red line, bare minimum, was a cessation of all delivery of construction materials to the Sierra Madre, and China would allow humanitarian supplies, water, food, etc., in as long as China knew about it in advance, because the Sierra Madre would eventually, in that case, fall apart, which is exactly what China wants. And so accepting that would be, I mean, de facto a surrender. It would be worse than what the status quo was at the end of the Duterte administration. And that's clearly unacceptable to the Philippines. The Philippine red line has been, we can do whatever we want because this is an underwater reef belonging to the Philippines exclusive economic zone as guaranteed by the 2016 award. And we certainly can't ask China for permission to resupply our own forces in an area where only we have a legal right. So given that huge gulf, they can try to agree that, no more waving of boat hooks and knives. But is there really any way to bridge that gap beyond the short term?
All that's really needed is to simply maintain the status quo as it was for the past, 25 years now. I mean, just leave the Sierra Madre alone. After all, it poses absolutely no threat to China or any of their activities. It's a rusting ship in the middle of nowhere, essentially. So I think its real value and the reason why it's such a focus of attention for China is really the symbolic value of that ship. It symbolizes Philippine resistance to Chinese power. It symbolizes UNCLOS and our rights and entitlements under international law. And I think especially for the Communist Party, it also is a potential source of maybe inspiration and resistance to China over the long term, not just for the Philippines, but also the rest of the region. When Bush made that statement, some months ago, saying that China needs to apply more pressure or else the other Southeast Asian nations might decide to take legal action and, make use of peaceful means to try to assert their rights. No? I mean, I think that's a very stark manifestation of that fear that what the Philippines is doing and what a Jungian shoal represents really is a real threat to China's growing power in the region.
Is there going to be a repeat of what we've seen in and around Second Thomas Shoal with Sabina Shoal? Because we've seen headlines that say, this is going to be the next flashpoint. What are the prospects for de-escalation in totality that would include Sabina Shoal or others around and nearby?
Well, quite frankly, it's not just Sabina Shoal, but every other major shoal or feature there in the West Philippine Sea, really. If you take a look at the deployment of the Maritime Militia and Coast Guard, they're practically guarding every feature there now. So Sabina Shoal happens to be one that garnered attention because it seemed to be a place where there's a larger concentration of Chinese militia forces before. But every other low tide elevation or feature or reef out there has at least one militia vessel, I think. So that's why I think we need to look at not just Second Thomas Shoal and what it means for Sabina. Actually, what we need to look at the bigger picture, which is that what's going on right now is that China is attempting to take control of the South China Sea, particularly the West Philippine Sea, from the Philippines through these measures as a demonstration to what will happen next, Malaysia, Indonesia. That's what's going on, I think. We have to look at it from that perspective.
So China was clearly the aggressor here. Borderline act of piracy should be where the focus remains. But there is, I think, worrying signs of disarray within Philippine policymaking and messaging that came out of this. And maybe the operation itself was a sign of the fracturing of the consensus within the Marcos government. I mean, by all appearances, the Navy decided to do this without the support of the National Security Council and the Coast Guard, et cetera. And then we had what seemed like a 4-day media blackout before the Philippines was willing to say anything. I mean, if you had told me this was going to happen, a month ago, what I would have said is, oh, so I assume there'll be a, nationwide press conference with President Marcos at a podium within 12 hours. And instead, it seemed like it took 4 days before the Philippine government could even decide whether to admit that it had happened. That continues. I mean, nobody seems to know who's calling the shots. The executive secretary seems to have been thrown under the bus by the defense secretary as they argue over whether or not to characterize this as an accident or an act of aggression. Is this just temporary? I mean, do you think that there actually is a consensus and what we're just seeing is kind of natural bureaucratic bickering?
There is a consensus in the sense that definitely the directives and the direction that everybody wants to take is to assert Philippine rights and entitlements and defend Second Shoal, defend it from being taken out by China one way or another. But there has been a transition with the establishment of the National Maritime Council. There is that, yes, and there is that bureaucratic bickering, as you call it, that also takes place. After all, this is a major issue, and for quite a while now, it has been directed by the NTF, the National Task Force for West Philippine Sea. But the National Task Force for West Philippine Sea is basically an artifact of the previous administration. So now with changes being made by the new administration, including addressing the maritime concerns, not just West Philippine Sea, but everything else as well, there is that period. So there is this transition, I think. And then there's also the need, I guess, for government to redirect and consolidate its efforts when it comes to this. For quite a while now, the centerpiece of the Philippines has been the transparency policy, the transparency initiative, which has produced a remarkable amount of support. It's generated a lot of international support for the Philippines and its positions in the West Philippine Sea. But on the other hand, it has become clear that China has been steadily escalating its actions and intensifying its moves against the Philippines. And this latest one, I think, is just a sign of that. I would tend to think that what happened, particularly on June 17, that violent incident, was also, in a way, kind of panic reaction on the part of the China Coast Guard. They were surprised that the Philippines actually was able to reach the Sierra Madre, those two boats. Whoever was the commander on the ground really just lost it, I guess. And that's why I think that also stressed to both sides the danger really in this situation where everybody's on edge and everybody's still pushing without letting up. No? And maybe that's why now they tried using this BCM as the opportunity now to try to find ways to at least stabilize the situation, hopefully begin the process of stepping back from this brink.
Yeah, you mentioned the region several times. I want to pick up on your references to countries neighboring the Philippines. I've heard privately that the Philippines is disappointed with some of the other Southeast Asian, South China Sea claimants. Is that the sense far and wide in the Philippines that they're left alone and there's no real support, moral or otherwise, from their neighbors against China?
I think, well, from different perspectives, if you're talking about like the public, the general perception, of course, there is that sense that why isn't ASEAN helping us? Why they're keeping quiet? But then again, it's not a surprise to them either. They kept quiet even before. We had Scarborough Shoal. So actually, they would be surprised if any of the claimants actually spoke up. And the surprise came up with Vietnam last week. And Vietnam, in reaction to the continental self-submission, said that it was willing to talk. Within the diplomatic circles, they're aware of that. And I mean, that has been the operating condition, shall we say, the operating environment really, that we can't really expect the other claimant countries to speak up on this. But I think there are some signs that there is some understanding, at least, with Vietnam, with Brunei. Recently, the government announced that they had memorandum of understanding with these two countries. And they're still talking with Indonesia and Malaysia on this. So I think this time there's a little bit more optimism on the part of the diplomats, at least. There will be some slight change in the positioning. And maybe this latest incident might be a cause of that. As for the rest of ASEAN, the non-claimant countries, I think it's a given that they will not really speak up at this point and they'll keep quiet. And especially with the current chairmanship of the ASEAN, they're not really expecting major improvements, shall we say. But as long as nobody really just tips the boat back and then turns it towards China, these are the cards that we're dealt with. We'll try to make the best of it.
So you don't think in a little over a month, when Secretary Manalo heads to the ASEAN Regional Forum, he's going to try to push for any stronger language? It's just going to go in accepting that doesn't really matter what China does to the Philippines, there will be no ASEAN support.
They will still try after all. That's the objective. It's just that, I guess, after all of these experiences within ASEAN, they know that there are limits really to what ASEAN can do and say.
A similar question on the U.S. What has this done to the discussion within Philippine government and among the Philippine public about the U.S. support, perceptions of U.S. response to this incident? I've heard some whispers of complaint, although there seemed to be pretty unclear to me. I don't think there was any request from the Philippines to do anything, so I'm not sure how the U.S. could fail when there was no request. But it certainly, reignited the debates about the outlines of the Mutual Defense Treaty and what it would mean to trigger obligations under Article 4. Yeah. Where does all of that stand?
Well, more broadly speaking, I think the debate has been more on the value, basically, with the alliance and whether it really deters China from taking these actions. No? The fact that they went that far, of course, led to that discussion where, they're not scared. So it's along those lines. As for the triggering of the MDT, yes, of course, there was a huge brouhaha about why don't we trigger the MDT now, etc. But number one, it's a political decision on the part of the government whether or not to avail of the MDT. And number two, triggering the MDT for most people implies going to war, which it shouldn't, but unfortunately, that's how they understand it. And so for government, that's not a good choice either. What this recent incident has sort of underscored is the need for really coordinated actions and decisions, especially if it will involve the alliance. I've observed really that in this particular situation, it seemed that, there was no real coordination with any of the allies and friends. Everybody was surprised. Everybody was asking for questions, and everybody was just as puzzled about the news blackout. But then the question was legitimately raised, how can the allies act to help you if you don't even tell them where you are and what you're doing? So I think that really underscored the need for, on the Philippine side, to really think about how they're supposed to really operationalize this alliance and how they're supposed to make it work. It's not just a document that will be quote unquote triggered. And they really have to look at it realistically and come up with scenarios and make sure that in any case where alliance action might be an option, they better make sure that the allies are also prepared to take any joint action and response.
So Jay, what's the way forward for the Philippines at least? Because at the beginning of the year, I think there were hopes that maybe these tensions that we were seeing would calm down a little, but the reverse has been the case. From Manila's standpoint, how do you proceed?
Well, the thing is, from the Philippines perspective, it's just doing the same thing it has been doing. Same 4 boats, same 2 resupply ships, and same 2 Coast Guard vessels, and China just kept escalating. And so now the decision has been made to, supply with Navy vessels, we have this incident, which is quite violent. That is rather frustrating. But as I said, anytime you try a new operation, there's always a chance of failure just as much as success. So we just take it on the chin and move on. Way forward for the Philippines, really, all it wants to do right now is just keep that outpost operational, maintain the Sierra Madre, despite China's increasing belligerence. And I think that will remain to be the objective. I think China has to realize that banging on the Sierra Madre is really just costing it a lot more than it's worth. And hopefully at the BCM yesterday and today, they come to realize that. I think one of the statements issued by Yusek Lazaro was that the Philippines has indicated that it will be relentless on this particular point. I think that's the indication of the direction that they want to take, arriving at some kind of modus vivendi on this, and also hoping that actually that China would de-escalate. The burden is really greater on China. It's the one with the superior deployment of forces and the one that has been taking all these outrageous actions. It's really on their side. So we'll see. Right now, I see it as a kind of like BCM, and then these discussions like somebody calling for a timeout. But in the meantime, everything the forces deployed are still the same. Hopefully, that will give people time enough to breathe and think about exactly what it is that they're doing and where it's going to lead, and then consider other options of resolving these issues.
Well, we've just begun to unpack the implications of the June 17th incident, but luckily for all those listening who want to hear more, this should be dropping on July 11th, which is also the day of the 14th annual CSIS South China Sea Conference, at which Jay will also be speaking on our first panel, and Assistant Secretary Eli Ratner will be speaking at lunch, along with a lot of other smarter folks than me. So if you haven't gotten enough South China Sea, click on over to CSIS. You can probably still catch the last half of the live stream, or if you're listening to this tomorrow, July 12th, the whole thing will be up. In the meantime, Jay and Elina, thanks so much for joining. And to all of you, as always, thanks for listening. We'll be back in a couple weeks with the next episode of Southeast Asia Radio.
Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Southeast Asia Radio. Feel free to write us with any comments, questions, or feedback at searadio@csis.org. We'll get back to you.
Do us a favor and subscribe and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever streaming platform that you listen to us on. Tell your friends about us.
Marla Hiller is our producer, and our interns are Zhang Pham, Emily De Leon, and Pani Thuel. Our co-hosts today were Greg Poling and Elina Noor. My name is Japhet Kitson.
And I'm Lauren Mai.
And we'll see you in 2 weeks for another episode of Southeast Asia Radio.